The fluorescent lights of Denver International Airport cast harsh shadows across Gate 23 as passengers shuffled toward Flight 447. In row 12, a man named Marcus Chen slept peacefully, his worn baseball cap pulled low over weathered features. His calloused hands clutched a child's drawing of a purple airplane. To fellow travelers, he appeared ordinary. Just another working-class father heading home. But beneath that humble exterior lay secrets that could save lives or destroy everything he had left. 20,000 feet above Colorado, when mechanical failure would transform routine flight into nightmare, Captain Sarah Mitchell would ask the question that changes everything. Is there a pilot on board? The man in row 12 would stir awake, meeting desperate eyes of flight attendants. What they couldn't know was that Marcus had once commanded the skies as the youngest airline captain in American aviation history. Marcus Chen folded his 6-foot frame into the cramped middle seat, his shoulders hunched with the practiced invisibility of a man who had learned to disappear. At 42, premature gray streaked through his black hair, each silver strand a testament to nights spent staring at ceiling fans in one-bedroom apartments. His weathered denim jacket bore no insignia, no hint of the gold wings that once adorned his chest. The expensive leather flight bag had been replaced by a battered backpack, stuffed with work boots and safety equipment. To passengers glancing his way, Marcus appeared to be just another blue-collar worker heading home after a long week. But his dark eyes held depths that construction sites couldn't explain. Those same eyes had once scanned instrument panels with the precision of a surgeon, had watched sunrises break over cloud formations 35,000 feet above the Pacific. His hands, now rough with calluses from hammer and drill, still moved with the unconscious grace of someone who had once commanded machines worth $200 million. Even in sleep, his fingers twitched with muscle memory, adjusting imaginary trim tabs and monitoring phantom airspeed indicators. In his jacket pocket, wrapped carefully in tissue paper like a sacred relic, lay his most precious possession. 8-year-old Emma had drawn it with purple crayon during their last visit, her small hands working with the intense concentration only children possess. The stick-figure pilot wore an enormous smile beneath his peaked cap, standing proudly beside an airplane with wings that stretched across the entire page. In careful block letters across the bottom, she had written the words that both sustained and tormented him during endless nights of doubt. My daddy flies planes like Superman. Marcus hadn't worn a pilot's uniform in 1,847 days. He counted them all, each morning marking another day of exile from the only life he had ever wanted. The gold wings pin sat locked away in a storage unit outside Phoenix, alongside commendations from 3 different airlines and a photograph of him shaking hands with the Secretary of Transportation. That young captain seemed like a stranger now, standing confidently in his pressed uniform, surrounded by colleagues who respected his expertise and judgment. Marcus had been aviation royalty once, the youngest pilot ever hired by Mountain West Airlines at 26, promoted to captain by 35, with a reputation for calm leadership that earned him the nickname Steady Eddie among crews who flew international routes. Those same colleagues now crossed to the other side of terminal concourses when they spotted him. The aviation community was smaller than most people realized, and news of his disgrace had spread through cockpits and crew lounges like wildfire. Former friends who had once sought his advice on difficult approaches now avoided his calls. The monthly pilot reunions happened without him, his empty chair at their usual table, serving as an unspoken reminder of how quickly a career could crumble. Marcus had become aviation's cautionary tale, his name whispered in flight training sessions as an example of what happened when pride overcame procedure. His ex-wife Jennifer still introduced him to her new friends as my ex-husband, who used to be a pilot, as if his fall from 6-figure salary to construction wages was the most interesting thing about him. She didn't understand why he had walked away from everything they had built together. She couldn't comprehend the choice he had made that dark November night over Colorado, or the 127 souls he had saved by sacrificing his own future. Some burdens were too heavy to share, even with the people who had once promised to love you through anything. The divorce papers had been signed 3 years ago, but the wounds still ached with every awkward custody exchange, every reminder of the life he could no longer provide. Now, Marcus installed drywall for $12 an hour and picked up Emma every other weekend when the courts allowed it. His 1-bedroom apartment in North Seattle smelled of instant coffee and resignation, its walls decorated with his daughter's artwork and nothing else. The mortgage on their former house in Phoenix had been foreclosed when the legal bills overwhelmed his construction wages. Everything he had worked for, every dream he had nurtured, reduced to boxes in a storage unit he could barely afford to keep. But Emma's drawings remained, taped to his refrigerator like medals of honor, reminding him that in one person's eyes, he was still a hero. The November sky over Colorado had been deceptively calm when Flight 892 departed Phoenix bound for Tokyo with 312 souls on board. Marcus remembered every detail with the crystalline clarity that trauma burns into memory. First Officer Lisa Park had been reviewing approach plates when the first warning light flickered red on the engine display. Captain Marcus Chen, 37 years old and invincible in his pressed uniform, had dismissed it as a minor sensor malfunction. They were flying a Boeing 777, one of the most reliable aircraft ever built. Cruising at 39,000 feet through clear air with 14 hours of fuel remaining. The storm system hadn't appeared on weather radar until they were already committed to their route over the Rockies. What meteorologists had predicted as light turbulence became a monster of wind shear and ice that seemed to reach up from the peaks like grasping fingers. Marcus could still feel the moment when the aircraft's fly-by-wire system began sending conflicting commands to the control surfaces. The sickening sensation of a machine fighting its own programming while death waited in the mountain valleys below. Lisa's voice had cracked when she called out the first altitude warning, her usual professionalism stripped away by the violent shuddering that threw them against their harnesses. The massive aircraft groaned like a living thing as it struggled against forces that seemed determined to tear it apart. Warning bells filled the cockpit with their urgent chorus, while red lights painted the instrument panel in hellish hues. Marcus had felt the controls growing sluggish in his hands, watched the altitude indicator unwind toward terrain that remained invisible in the storm clouds. In that moment, with 312 lives depending on his next decision, Marcus had chosen instinct over procedure. He disconnected the autopilot and took manual control, feeling the aircraft respond to his touch like a wounded animal. The flight management computer screamed warnings as he exceeded structural limitations, pulling G-forces that stressed the airframe beyond design parameters. Air traffic control ordered him to maintain altitude and heading. But Marcus could feel the mountains reaching up through the clouds, could sense the narrow corridors between peaks that offered their only chance of survival. For 47 minutes, he had flown by pure instinct, trusting hands that had learned their craft over 15 years of commanding the skies. When they finally broke through the cloud deck and saw the lights of Denver International Airport spread below them like a constellation of hope, Marcus had pulled off what aviation experts would later call miraculous airmanship. Every soul on board walked away without injury, their lives saved by a captain who had chosen to break every rule in the book. The Federal Aviation Administration investigation had been as thorough as it was merciless. Captain Sarah Mitchell, 10 years younger than Marcus and ambitious beyond measure, had led the inquiry with the cold precision of a prosecutor. Her ice-blue eyes had catalogued every violation, every deviation from standard operating procedures. Every moment when Marcus had trusted judgment over checklists. The fact that he had saved 312 lives seemed irrelevant compared to the 17 protocols he had violated in the process. Reckless endangerment, her final report had concluded. Captain Chen's actions, while ultimately successful, demonstrated a cavalier disregard for established safety protocols that cannot be tolerated in commercial aviation. Her recommendation for license suspension had been unanimous among the review board. Her career launched on the foundation of his destruction. Sarah Mitchell had built her reputation as the investigator tough enough to hold even heroes accountable, earning promotion to Chief Flight Safety Officer and eventually her own captain's wings with Mountain West Airlines. The settlement offer from Mountain West had been simple and devastating. Resign immediately with a positive reference letter, or fight the decision and never fly for a major carrier again. Marcus had thought of Emma, barely 3 years old and dependent on the stability his salary provided. He had signed the papers and walked away from the cockpit, trading his captain's stripes for a hard hat and the respect of colleagues for the anonymity of a construction site. The construction yard in North Seattle was a different kind of cockpit, one where decisions involved lumber measurements rather than lives, where mistakes meant bent nails rather than twisted metals scattered across mountainsides. Marcus arrived each morning at 5:30. His lunch packed in the same insulated bag that had once carried flight manuals to destinations around the globe. The other workers knew him as college boy, a reference to his articulate speech and the engineering background that sometimes surfaced in conversations about load-bearing calculations. Carlos Mendoza, a third-generation carpenter with hands like leather and a heart bigger than his paycheck, would call out his daily greeting with genuine affection. "Hey, college boy, you sure you know which end of that drill to hold?" The other men would chuckle, not with malice, but with the easy camaraderie of people who understood the dignity of working with their hands. They didn't know that Marcus had once been responsible for aircraft worth more than their combined annual salaries, that his decisions had once affected hundreds of lives with every flight. The mockery cut deeper when it came from people who should have understood loss. At Emma's school events, Marcus stood alone, while other fathers discussed their careers in technology and finance, their voices carrying the casual confidence of men who had never watched their worlds crumble overnight. Patricia Holbrook, the PTA president, with her perfectly styled hair and designer handbags, would ask about his work with the patronizing tone wealthy women reserved for hired help. "What do you do, Mr. Chen?" she had inquired at the fall carnival, her smile bright as surgical steel. When Marcus answered construction, that smile had frozen into something resembling pity. "How honest," she had replied, the word dripping with condescension before she turned to discuss European vacation plans with more suitable company. Marcus had stood beside the dunking booth, watching his daughter laugh with her classmates, wondering if Emma noticed how other parents avoided conversations with her father. The custody hearings had been exercises in systematic humiliation, each session another opportunity for Jennifer's attorney to dissect his fall from grace with surgical precision. Rebecca Sterling was a shark in expensive suits, her closing arguments painting Marcus as a man whose poor judgment had cost him everything and now threatened his ability to provide for his daughter. "Your Honor," she had declared to Judge Patricia Hernandez, "Mr. Chen has demonstrated a pattern of decision-making that destroyed his professional career and reduced his earning capacity by 60%. Marcus had sat in his only remaining suit, a Navy ensemble purchased for job interviews that never materialized, and watched strangers debate his fitness as a father. When Judge Hernandez asked him to explain why he had left aviation, Marcus had wanted to describe the storm over Colorado, the way 312 lives had balanced on his ability to trust instinct over training. Instead, he had simply said that he had made decisions that didn't align with company policy, his voice steady, despite the humiliation burning in his chest. The internet preserved his disgrace with digital permanence, old headlines surfacing whenever potential employers ran background checks. "Disgraced pilot loses license after reckless flying. Hero or hazard?" The Marcus Chen investigation. Hiring managers would call him in for interviews, curious to meet the man who had saved hundreds of lives and lost his career doing it, then send polite rejection letters, citing cultural fit as their reason for choosing someone else. Even his brother David, successful and well-meaning from his software engineering perch in San Francisco, had grown tired of Marcus's refusal to move on. "Maybe it's time to consider a different path," he would suggest during their monthly phone calls. "You could go back to school, get an MBA, start fresh in a field that doesn't remind you of what happened." David meant well, but he couldn't understand that Marcus wasn't trying to forget aviation. He was trying to survive each day, knowing that the thing he was born to do remained forever beyond his reach. The worst moments came late at night when Emma slept in her tiny bedroom, her gentle breathing the only sound in his apartment. Marcus would sit at his kitchen table calculating and recalculating expenses, watching numbers that never quite added up no matter how many times he rearranged them. Child support, rent, groceries, Emma's school supplies. His construction wages stretched like rubber bands, always threatening to snap under the pressure of providing for a daughter who deserved so much more than he could give. Sometimes he would open his laptop and browse aviation job postings, torturing himself with opportunities that might as well have existed on distant planets. Seeking experienced captain for international routes, must possess valid ATP license and clean safety record. The qualifications mocked him from the screen, reminders of a professional identity that had been stripped away as efficiently as his uniform. The isolation was perhaps cruelest of all. Marcus had lost more than his career. He had lost his tribe, his sense of purpose, his belief in himself as someone who mattered. Former colleagues stopped returning calls, their silence speaking volumes about aviation's unforgiving culture. The flying magazines that had once featured his articles on crew resource management now carried insights from other experts, other voices, other captains who hadn't been forced to choose between rules and lives. But Emma kept him tethered to hope during the darkest hours. Every other weekend, when she climbed into his Honda Civic chattering about school and friends and dreams, Marcus remembered why he had made the choices that destroyed everything else. She still drew pictures of airplanes with purple crayons, still insisted that her daddy was the best pilot in the world even though she couldn't understand why he didn't fly anymore. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything? How do you tell her that real heroes don't always get happy endings? The letter from the Federal Aviation Administration arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in October, forwarded through 3 previous addresses before finding Marcus in his North Seattle apartment. The envelope bore the agency's official seal, a logo that had once represented opportunity and now carried only the weight of bureaucratic finality. Marcus's hands trembled as he tore it open, knowing that nothing good ever came from the FAA after what had happened 5 years ago. Final notice. Pilot license expiration. The header announced in bold letters that seemed to pulse with administrative authority. Marcus scanned the formal language, but the message was devastatingly clear. His commercial pilot license, suspended pending review for 5 long years, would officially expire in 30 days, unless he completed recertification requirements that might as well have demanded he climb Mount Everest blindfolded. After expiration, even if he somehow cleared his record, he would have to start over completely. All those years of training, all those hours building experience in cockpits from crop dusters to wide-body jets, all those moments of pure joy when he had felt truly alive at the controls of an aircraft would be reduced to expensive memories, gathering dust in storage units he could barely afford to keep. The young man who had soloed at 17, who had dreamed of touching the sky every night of his childhood, who had sacrificed everything to earn his wings, would cease to exist even on paper. Marcus sat at his kitchen table with the letter spread before him like a death certificate. Emma's latest drawing of a purple airplane, providing bitter contrast to the bureaucratic language that was erasing his identity. Outside his window, Seattle's autumn rain drummed against glass with the same relentless rhythm that had marked every day of his exile from the clouds. He could let it expire. It would be easier that way. No more hope torturing him with impossible possibilities. No more painful reminders of what flying had meant to him. No more dreams that woke him in cold sweats, remembering the feel of control yokes in his hands. His phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer, each word precisely crafted to inflict maximum damage. Emma's school play is next Friday at 7 p.m. Try not to show up in work clothes this time. The casual cruelty hit him like a physical blow, another reminder that even his ex-wife saw him as nothing more than an embarrassment, a cautionary tale about men who couldn't provide the life their families deserved. Marcus stared at the FAA letter until the words blurred together, until 5 years of rejection and humiliation seemed to press against his chest like a mountain. But then Emma's drawing caught his eye again, purple crayon bright against the kitchen table's scarred wood. In her careful child's handwriting, she had written the words that had sustained him through every sleepless night and hopeless dawn. "My daddy is brave." Marcus picked up the paper, studying the crooked airplane and stick figure pilot with his enormous smile, remembering the afternoon she had created it while he graded construction blueprints at the same table. Emma still believed in him. In a world that had written him off as damaged goods, she still saw him as a hero worthy of purple crayons and refrigerator displays. Maybe that was enough to face another day. Maybe it had to be enough to keep the license alive just a little longer, even if he never used it again. Maybe faith sometimes mattered more than feasibility, and hope more than probability. Marcus folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer where he kept all the important papers of his diminished life, then picked up Emma's drawing and walked to the refrigerator where it would join the gallery of love that reminded him who he used to be. 37 minutes after Flight 447 lifted off from Denver International Airport, routine became catastrophe with the subtle efficiency that transforms ordinary Tuesdays into dates that families remember forever. Marcus had been dozing fitfully in seat 12D, his body folded uncomfortably between strangers who probably earned in a month what he used to make in a week, when the first tremor ran through the Boeing 737's airframe like a tuning fork struck by an invisible hand. Most passengers dismissed the vibration as turbulence, returning to their screens and magazines with the casual indifference of frequent flyers. But 15 years of commanding aircraft had taught Marcus to distinguish between the dozens of sounds and sensations that composed normal flight operations and the subtle warnings that preceded disaster. His eyes snapped open with the instant alertness of a pilot trained to wake from deepest sleep at the first sign of trouble. His body, straightening in the cramped seat as instincts honed over thousands of flight hours, overrode 5 years of trying to forget who he used to be. The aircraft was handling wrong. Marcus could feel it in the way the cabin tilted slightly to port. A deviation so minute that passengers chatting about weekend plans remained oblivious to the drama unfolding in the cockpit 30 feet ahead of them. The engines sounded different too, a subtle change in their harmonic vibration that spoke of systems struggling against forces they weren't designed to handle. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood in the aisle, ignoring the annoyed glances from passengers forced to move their legs, his pilot's instincts screaming warnings that his rational mind tried to suppress. Then Captain Sarah Mitchell's voice crackled through the cabin speakers, professionally calm but carrying undertones that made Marcus's blood freeze in recognition. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some technical difficulties and will be making an emergency descent to a lower altitude. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for possible turbulence." Marcus had used that exact tone himself once, over mountains shrouded in storm clouds, when he had chosen to break every rule in aviation's sacred book to bring 312 souls safely home. He recognized the controlled panic beneath Captain Mitchell's professional delivery, the way a pilot's voice carried authority even when reporting circumstances that threatened to spiral beyond human control. This was worse than routine mechanical failure. This was the kind of emergency that ended careers or lives, sometimes both. The Boeing lurched violently to starboard, throwing passengers against their armrests as carry-on bags tumbled from overhead compartments like deadly confetti. Screams echoed through the cabin as oxygen masks deployed with their familiar yellow cups and tangled tubing, the sight that every frequent flyer dreaded but few ever experienced. Flight attendant Jessica Rodriguez moved through the chaos with professional grace, helping an elderly woman secure her mask while her own face remained calm despite the terror Marcus could read in her dark eyes. The aircraft shuddered again, more violently this time, and Marcus felt his stomach drop as they entered an uncontrolled descent. Through the small windows, he could see the Rocky Mountains rising to meet them like stone monuments to gravity's relentless pull. They were losing altitude faster than any normal emergency descent profile, the kind of rate that spoke of pilots fighting controls that no longer responded to human input. He had been here before, in this exact situation, where seconds stretched into eternities and decisions made in heartbeats determined whether families would gather for dinner or funerals. Captain Mitchell's voice returned to the speakers, and now the professional mask had slipped enough for passengers to hear the desperation she was trying to hide behind years of training. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have experienced a significant malfunction with our primary flight controls and are declaring an emergency with Denver approach control." She paused, and Marcus could imagine her scanning the instrument panel painted with red warning lights, calculating odds that grew worse with every second they remained airborne. "Is there a pilot on board? Any pilot with commercial aviation experience, please identify yourself to the flight attendants immediately." The cabin fell silent, except for the sound of rushing air and labored breathing of 238 terrified passengers. Around him, faces turned upward toward the speakers, as if prayer might summon salvation from the overhead compartments. A businessman in first class raised his trembling hand. "I have a private pilot's license," he called out, his voice cracking with fear and hope. "Single-engine Cessna, about 50 hours total time." Jessica Rodriguez looked at him with the expression of someone who had just watched a child volunteer to perform brain surgery. Weekend warriors with Cessna experience were admirable, but asking one to handle a crippled Boeing 737 was like asking someone who could ride a bicycle to pilot a space shuttle. She nodded politely and continued scanning the cabin for someone, anyone, who might possess the skills needed to prevent the disaster that seemed increasingly inevitable with each passing second. Marcus took a step forward into the aisle, then another. Every eye in the cabin focused on him as he made his way toward the front of the aircraft, his movements carrying the calm authority that had once commanded respect in cockpits around the world. His voice, when he spoke to Jessica Rodriguez, carried none of the hesitation that had marked 5 years of construction sites and custody hearings. "I'm Captain Marcus Chen," he said quietly, each word weighted with the confidence of someone who had faced this nightmare before. 15 years commercial aviation, type-rated on Boeing aircraft. "I can help her." Jessica Rodriguez stared at him with the wonder reserved for answered prayers and unexpected miracles. She had heard stories about passengers who claimed piloting experience. Usually intoxicated businessmen whose flight simulator games had convinced them they could land real aircraft. But something in Marcus's steady gaze, in the way he moved through the chaotic cabin like he belonged there, told her this was different. This was real. "Follow me," she said, leading him toward the cockpit door that separated passengers from the two pilots fighting for all their lives. Captain Sarah Mitchell looked up from her instrument panel as Marcus entered the flight deck, and time seemed to freeze between them like a photograph capturing the moment when past and present collided with the force of destiny. She was older now, her blonde hair pulled back in the severe bun that all female pilots seemed to favor, her ice blue eyes reflecting the red warning lights that covered her controls like Christmas decorations in hell. The years had carved lines around those eyes, stress marks that spoke of the weight carried by pilots who held responsibility for other people's lives in their hands every time they pushed back from the gate. "You," she said simply. The single word containing 5 years of history, investigation reports, and ruined careers. The man who had broken every rule to save 312 lives sat down in her first officer's seat, as if no time had passed, his hands moving automatically to the controls with the muscle memory that never truly fades. Marcus could read the aircraft's condition in the scattered red lights and warning messages that painted the cockpit in urgent hues. Hydraulic pressure at 0. Flight management computer offline. Manual reversion on primary flight controls. It was worse than his nightmare over Colorado, but familiar in the way that recurring dreams never quite leave your subconscious. "Can you fly this thing?" Sarah asked. And for the first time since Marcus had known her, Captain Mitchell's voice carried no authority, no professional distance, only the desperate hope of a pilot who had run out of options and found herself face to face with the one person who might understand the choice she was about to make. The investigation that had destroyed his career seemed insignificant compared to the 238 souls depending on decisions they would make together in the next few minutes. Marcus looked at the instrument panel, at the altitude indicator showing their continued descent toward peaks that remained hidden in cloud cover, at the flight controls that responded to input like a wounded animal fighting to survive. He thought of Emma's purple crayon drawing in his jacket pocket, of the choice between following procedures and saving lives, of the moment 5 years ago, when he had decided that some things mattered more than regulations. "Yeah," he said quietly, his hands already reaching for the control yoke that felt like coming home after years in exile. "I can fly it." The Boeing 737 responded to Marcus's touch like a thoroughbred horse recognizing its master's hands on the reins. 5 years of construction sites and custody hearings melted away as he felt the aircraft's wounded systems respond to inputs guided by instincts that had never truly left him. Together with Captain Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had once destroyed his career, Marcus Chen began fighting for the lives of everyone on board Flight 447. Outside the cockpit windows, the mountains waited with patient malevolence. But inside the flight deck, 2 pilots who understood the weight of command worked together toward the miracle that would define both their futures. The landing at Denver International Airport, 17 minutes later, would be remembered as textbook perfect, the kind of arrival that made aviation look easy to passengers who had no idea how close they had come to becoming another tragic headline. As Flight 447 rolled to a stop surrounded by emergency vehicles with their flashing lights painting the tarmac in reds and blues, the cabin erupted in applause and tears that echoed through the terminal windows where families waited for loved ones they had feared they might never see again. Marcus sat quietly in the first officer's seat, his hands still resting on controls that had responded to his touch, like old friends welcoming him home after a long absence. Through the cockpit windows, he watched firefighters and paramedics positioning equipment they would not need, their faces showing the relief of emergency responders who had prepared for disaster but found victory instead. The weight of 238 lives successfully delivered settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden, one he had carried for 15 years before 5 years of exile had stripped it away. Captain Sarah Mitchell turned to face him, tears streaming down cheeks that had maintained professional composure throughout their shared battle against mechanical failure and gravitational certainty. "Marcus," she began, then stopped as words proved inadequate for the moment they were sharing. They had saved lives together. Former enemies, united by the ancient brotherhood of pilots, who had faced death at 30,000 feet and emerged victorious through skill, luck, and the kind of teamwork that transcended personal history. "Thank you," she said finally, the two words carrying weight that filled the cockpit more completely than any lengthy speech. Marcus nodded and began running through the post-flight checklist from memory, his movements precise and economical, as he powered down systems that had performed beyond their design specifications under the guidance of human hands that understood their language. He had always believed that flying was not about the drama of takeoffs or the serenity of cruise altitude, but about the sacred responsibility of bringing everyone home safely to families who trusted pilots to make the right decisions when everything went wrong. 3 months later, Marcus received a phone call that would change his life as dramatically as the investigation that had ended his career 5 years earlier. Captain Sarah Mitchell had filed a comprehensive report about Flight 447, recommending the immediate reinstatement of his pilot's license and commending his exemplary airmanship under extraordinary circumstances. The investigation that had once painted him as recklessly dangerous now served as foundation for his professional resurrection, proof that sometimes the right choice transcends the safe choice. The Federal Aviation Administration moved with uncharacteristic speed, processing his reinstatement paperwork in weeks rather than the months or years typically required for license restoration. Phone calls came from airlines that had once treated his name like a contagious disease, human resources departments suddenly interested in hiring the pilot, whose split-second decision-making had saved 238 lives above the Colorado Rockies. Mountain West Airlines offered him a captain's position with full seniority restoration, as if 5 years of construction sites and custody battles had been nothing more than an extended vacation. But Marcus had learned something profound during his years of exile from the skies. Being a pilot was not just about commanding aircraft or wearing gold wings on pressed uniforms. It was about accepting responsibility for other people's lives, about finding courage to make difficult decisions when the stakes couldn't be higher, and about understanding that some victories are measured not in personal gain, but in lives saved and families kept whole. The man who returned to aviation after 5 years away was not the same captain who had walked away from everything rather than fight for his reputation. On a crisp morning in March, Marcus walked through the crew gate at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, wearing a captain's uniform that fit him like armor forged specifically for his shoulders. Emma's latest purple crayon drawing occupied the same place in his breast pocket, where regulations required pilots to carry their licenses, a reminder that heroes don't announce themselves with fanfare, but simply rise when circumstances demand their best. As he settled into the left seat of a Boeing 737 bound for destinations that once again lay within his reach, Marcus thought about the choice that had cost him everything and given him back something far more valuable: the knowledge that when it mattered most, he had chosen correctly. Some battles are won not with power or position, but with the quiet dignity of people who understand that doing right matters more than being right. If you were in his position, facing the choice between rules and lives, between safety and survival, would you have the courage to trust your instincts when everything you had worked for hung in the balance?